I'm Flo, and ever since I can remember, my family has treated me like an afterthought. All I could think of as a child was my younger sister Sophie, the shining star, the golden child, the person who could do no wrong. Sophie fulfilled my parents' long-held desire to have a daughter. Me? I was the bookworm, the awkward one, and the one who preferred to work out math problems to mingle at parties. I was bright and wanted to learn, but in a family that rewarded beautiful looks above intelligence, I may as well have been invisible. One day in particular, Sophie was 10 and I was 12. I had recently won a spelling bee in my area, and we were at a family BBQ. I couldn't wait to tell everyone who would listen the news. Mom, Dad, guess what? With my degree in hand, I hurried up to them. I won the spelling bee. My mom gave me a short glance before swiftly returning her focus to Sophie, who was flipping cartwheels on the grass. How lovely, my love. She blurted out, Sophie, sweetie, be careful. You might get grass stains on your new dress. I stood there, clenching the award in my hand, and watched as family members gushed over Sophie's athletic ability. Nobody inquired about my accomplishment. Nobody gave a damn. Our parents were overtly biased. Sophie received new clothes, and I got second-hand stuff. I received library cards. Sophie got dancing classes. Sophie received compliments and attention, but I became used to being let down. The trend persisted as we got older. Sophie developed into a stunning adolescent who was lively and well-liked. I went further and deeper into my books and mathematics, seeking comfort in universes where ability was more important than charisma. In our home, the phrase, Chloe, why can't you be more like your sister, became a running joke. Sophie, darling, you're perfect just the way you are, would normally come next. I made an effort to ignore it. I convinced myself that eventually, my brilliance and diligence would be rewarded. I'd prove to them all one day that I was valuable too. I put myself into my studies with fresh zeal when I started high school. I was resolved to succeed, to produce accomplishments so noteworthy that my parents would be forced to acknowledge them. However, as things turned out, I was losing the struggle against Sophie's radiant popularity. I felt I had achieved the apex of my academic career in my junior year. I prevailed in a demanding state math competition, which pitted the sharpest brains against one another in a struggle of logic and numbers. I had a wave of joy and hope when they announced that I had won. I've done something genuinely exceptional, I thought to myself at last. That day, I ran home with the trophy in hand, excited to tell my family the good news. However, when I bounded through the door, I saw the familiar sight of my parents circling Sophie as she tried on a new costume. Mom, Dad, guess what? I exclaimed, giddy with anticipation. I won the state math competition. With a distracted smile, my mother looked up. Well, sweetie, that's nice. Sophie, please turn around, honey. Let's see the rear view of it. My father was fiddling with Sophie's outfit, and he never even looked up. Well done, Chloe. Sophie, are you certain that this size fits? It appears to be quite snug across the shoulders. I felt completely defeated as I stood there with my prize in hand. With my voice hardly audible above a whisper, I added, but it's the state competition. I beat out hundreds of other students. With barely any attention, my mother responded, That's great, sweetie. This weekend, Sophie has a major performance. We must ensure that everything is flawless. And just like that, Sophie's current project eclipsed my moment of victory once more. I went back to my room and set the trophy down on my desk, where it accumulated dust and no one else saw it but me. I put my entire being into each essay and form when it came time to apply to colleges. My aim was to secure admission to the top institution and establish my value once and for all. I'll never forget the day the admission letters came in. With a full scholarship, I had been admitted to a prominent institution to study financial analysis. As I read the letter, my fingers trembled and tears of relief and happiness streamed down my cheeks. Sophie was stretched out on the couch between my parents and me when I found them in the living room. I entered. I murmured, my voice quivering with passion, full scholarship to study financial analysis at. Oh my God. Sophie sprang from the couch and let out a sharp yell. I overlooked it. I must get a new outfit for my performance the following week. And the spotlight moved in an instant. My parents sprang up and grabbed their wallets and keys. With the acceptance letter tightly clenched in my palm, I stood in the deserted living room and watched the car pull out of the driveway. They returned late that evening, carrying suitcases brimming with Sophie's new outfit and accoutrements. My approval. It was never brought up again. Sophie's life changed as I pushed myself into my undergraduate coursework. She registered at the nearby community college, prioritizing her social life above her studies. She didn't take long to begin dating David, her love from high school. I became fully involved in the field of financial analytics, where I discovered a sense of fulfillment and satisfaction that I had never known. My brains and hard ethic were acknowledged and valued for once. I became good friends with a few people who were passionate about statistics and analysis. I finally felt like I belonged somewhere. Sophie's life was going just how our parents had always imagined it to be back home. Shortly after her college graduation, she wed David in an extravagant wedding that my parents couldn't afford. As a bridesmaid, I watched, feeling like a stranger in my own family once more. After a year of marriage, Sophie revealed she was expecting a child. You would have believed the sun rose and set in that delivery room the day she gave birth. My folks were ecstatic beyond measure. With tears in his eyes, my father said, "We're grandparents." "Shlo, is that really true? Are you not thrilled to have an aunt?" I genuinely felt pleased for Sophie. However, I couldn't help but feel stung by being passed over once more. In the light of Sophie's new parenthood, my recent employment at one of the most prominent financial businesses in the city felt inconsequential. The pattern continued when Anthony was born 2 years later. I was just Chloe, and Sophie was the ideal daughter in the perfect family. The overworked individual, the one who was never out on dates, the one without grandkids for them to swoon over. I had worked my way up to senior financial analyst by the time I was 30. I was now experiencing the sense of self-worth that had escaped me for so long. I was respected by my colleagues and sought after by clients. I decided to treat myself to a house as a way to celebrate my accomplishment. It was a lovely 4-bedroom house in a wonderful area. Although I didn't own a mansion by any means, I did own it since I paid cash for it. I had never felt a greater feeling of pride and success than I did the day I received the keys. I couldn't wait to show my family my new house. I believed that at last they would notice my accomplishments and would be pleased with me. My parents were giggling over their grandkids when they arrived, Sophie and her children in tow. My mother's primary observation during my tour of the house was, "It's such a big house for just one person, isn't it?" My heart sank. I attempted to explain, "It's an investment, and I have room for a home office now." My father answered, "Well, I suppose that's sensible," but his tone gave the impression that he didn't find it to be at all. "Make sure Grace doesn't touch anything, Sophie honey. We wish not to damage Aunt Chloe's belongings. It's a shame Chloe doesn't have a family to fill that big house, but I suppose her career is important to her," my mother said to Sophie as they were leaving. After moving into my new house for a few months, I was surprised to get an invitation to a family dinner. To put it mildly, I was taken aback. My family ignored me because I was weird and boring, and they frequently failed to invite me to events. Still, I agreed, thinking maybe things were getting better. With an uncomfortable shoulder touch, my father added, "Chloe, good of you to come. Take a seat. We need to talk about something crucial." I felt a knot in my gut. In our household, significant conversations typically resulted in something positive for Sophie and a bad experience for me. Nevertheless, I sat down and forced a grin. While eating supper, David's work and Sophie's children were the topics of discussion. I started to talk about a project I had recently finished successfully at work, but Anthony's unexpected cry for more cake overpowered me. My mother cleared her throat as we settled into the living room following supper. "Chloe, dear, we've been thinking." I braced myself, not knowing what to expect. She went on, sounding as though she had some sort of fatal ailment. "You're single, you have no kids, and you have that big house all to yourself." I answered hesitantly, "Yes," not like the direction things was taking. My dad jumped right in. "Well, we think it would be best if you gave your house to Sophie and her family." Thinking I had misheard, I blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "Give them the keys and move out," my mother explained, sounding as if she was requesting that I share the salt. "They need the space more than you do." I surveyed the crowd, expecting for someone to chuckle and declare that it was all a joke. But all I saw were grave expressions. David gave Sophie a patronizing smack on the shoulder as she sat there, looking arrogant. "You're joking, right?" At last, I was able to say. My mother responded, now Chloe, in that condescending tone I was so used with. "Avoid becoming self-centered. Sophie requires more personal space than you do. After all, you're just one person." My father said, "It's your sisterly duty," as if that clarified everything. Family helps family. I had the impression that I was in a warped parallel universe. "But it's my house," I said, scarcely raising my voice above a hush. "I paid for it out of my own pocket. I put a lot of effort into it." "Oh, come on, Chloe," Sophie said, her tone sweetly sweet. "You understand the challenges of parenting 2 children in our little apartment. You would be really helpful to us." With trembling hands, I got up. "No," I shouted, raising my voice. "Certainly not. My house is not being given to you." The space erupted. My parents began enumerating all the purported sacrifices they had made for me during the years. Sophie continued talking about the challenges of being a parent. David sat there, nodding in agreement as though everything in this scenario made perfect sense. I heard my mother calling after me as I left. "Reconsider it, Chloe. Be not self-centered." The days that followed that bizarre supper were a circus of unwelcome attention in my life. My parents appeared to have extensively disseminated the word about my self-centeredness among our larger family. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly became knowledgeable about my life and inundated me with texts and calls. My great-aunt Mildred called me one day. I hadn't seen her since I was a teenager. She said, "Chloe," into the phone, "I was informed about your predicament. How could you have such cold heart? You're like an old maid, hoarding money pointlessly." My cousin Mike, with whom I was scarcely acquainted, texted me the next day. "Hey Chloe, I've heard you're having trouble. Why don't you simply relocate to a secluded island and lead a hermit lifestyle? You're a recluse and an outsider already." 2 weeks following the calamitous family meal, I was recuperating at home with a nasty cold. I was drinking hot tea and curled up on my couch with a blanket when I heard something strange coming from my front door, the audible sound of someone trying to pry open the latch. My heart started beating faster. Was there an attempt to break in? Silently, I put down my cup and slithered toward the door, my legs trembling beneath me. As I pressed my sight to the peephole, I almost let out a gasp. My parents, David, and my sister were standing on my front porch. My parents were watching Sophie, who was kneeling by the lock with a hairpin in her hand. David stood somewhat apart, appearing anxious. I pulled open the door mindlessly. All of them leaped back, their faces displaying shocked emotions. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" With a scratchy voice from being cold, I demanded, but my fury was clear. They all looked at me for a little period, looking right at me. My mother then spoke out, which really shocked me. "We assumed you would be at work. We simply intended to move in." "Move in?" I said it again, skeptical. "You mean break in and squat in my house?" "Now, Chloe," my dad said in response, "we were aware that you wouldn't have reported us to the police. After all, we're family." Glancing past them, I noticed a vehicle parked in my driveway, crammed with luggage and boxes. Actually, they were planning to move in behind my back. I said, "Get off my property," in a menacing low voice. "Now, or I will call the police." I took out my phone, phoned 911, and held it up for them to see. The last opportunity, I murmured, "Leave, now." With a lengthy period of astonishment on their faces, they looked at me. And then, slowly, they started to back off. With trembling throughout my body, I watched them drive away. I shut the door, locked it, and sank to the floor, pressing my back against the sturdy wood. Once they were out of sight, I called a security firm the very following day and had security cameras placed all the way around my house. Not only were these cameras functional, but they also included a voice recording feature. But technology was insufficient on its own. I finally had the ideal excuse to buy the dog I'd always wanted. I made my way to the nearby animal shelter, hoping to locate a friend that could also act as a protector. That's how Max and I met. He was a big mixed-breed dog with sharp eyes and a cautious personality. The shelter employee told me his background, explaining that his former owners had abandoned him because he was very protective. I saw through his rough appearance to the devoted, caring dog that lay beneath. Max and I clicked right away. He was kind and kind at home, at my side all the time. But he turned into a watchful watchdog when visitors got close to the house, his powerful bark alerting anybody who dared to intrude. Max now has a gorgeous outdoor kennel that I furnished with an inviting doghouse and a plenty of toys. Frequently relaxing in the sun-kissed grass when he wasn't policing the boundaries, he appeared to like it. There was calm in life for 2 months. However, I had to miss a weekend's worth of work due to an emergency. Though Mrs. Davidson, my neighbor, reassured me that she would take good care of Max, I was reluctant to go. She loved him so much that when I worked late, she would frequently give him snacks and take him for walks. I felt somewhat relieved when I left. However, my phone rang on the second night of my journey. Mrs. Davidson answered, and she sounded desperate. "Chloe, my dear, there's been an incident," she uttered with trembling. Max bit a random person, pursued them down the street and out of the yard. The cops have arrived at this location. I boarded the first aircraft back, ideas racing through my head. I was greeted by a scene out of a horror movie when I got home. The automobile of my parents was parked in front of my residence. There was Sophie, looking equally arrogant and angry. I was horrified to see 2 cops waiting in my driveway. I took a cautious approach. "What's going on here?" A cop moved to the front. "We've received a report, ma'am, concerning your dog biting someone. Could you explain what transpired?" Before I could reply, Sophie interrupted. "My spouse was mauled by her monstrous dog, bit him and leaped over the fence. He could have been slain." All of a sudden, everything made sense. The bite had come from David. "That's not true," I asserted. "My dog was keeping trespassers away from my property. Should your spouse have been bitten, it was likely in an attempt to get into my home." Sophie's face took on an unattractive crimson hue. "You're lying. Set that beast down before it does harm to another person." Now my parents, who had been strangely silent, spoke out. With a sparkle in his eye, my father declared, "We'll be filing charges. You'll have to pay for David's medical bills, of course." The policeman saw the tension in the family as he glanced between us. "Ma'am, we have to send your dog to the kennel for assessment because of the complaint. He could have to be put down if he's found to be hostile." Seeing animal control load Max into their vehicle made my heart sink. Tears welled up in my eyes as he gazed at me, bewildered and heartbroken. My mother came up to me as animal control, and the cops drove off. She replied, "You know, Chloe, this whole thing could have been avoided if you had just given us the house." In a low voice, "There is yet time. We'll waive the fees if you give us the house. If not, you know what happens to dogs that are aggressive." A startling insight struck me like a flash of lightning as I stood in my driveway, watching my family drive away with a smug sense of accomplishment. The cameras that monitor security. Heart thumping in my chest, I ran into the home. When I opened my laptop and saw the security video from the night before, my palms trembled. I held my breath as the video started, hoping the cameras had caught what I needed. The video was really clear. I observed Sophie and David stealthily approaching my front door while glancing over their shoulders. With a deep growl coming from his throat, Max made an appearance on screen with his hackles rising. Then Sophie's voice was crystal clear to me. "Kick the dog, David. We may accuse Chloe of biting you and demand payment, or better yet, we can acquire the entire home in return for the dog's life." I was sick to my stomach, seeing David kick Max so viciously. Startled by the unexpected assault, the dog grabbed hold of David's leg to defend itself. Sophie screamed so loudly that Max had to quickly let go of Sophie. Max was perplexed and upset as the two of them fled. I spoke steadily when I contacted my folks the next morning. "I think we need to have a serious conversation," I remarked. "Can you all come over to my house?" My mother's sickly sweet voice came on the other end of the call, after a pause. "Obviously, my darling. We'll arrive immediately." After an hour, everyone showed up, including Sophie, my parents, and David with his leg heavily wrapped. I saw the victory in their eyes as they came into my living room. They believed they had prevailed. Sophie started pointing at things as she walked around the room right away. She stated, "We'll need to get rid of this ugly lamp," in a tone that was rife with contempt. "And this couch is just not cutting it. It will be swapped out for something more suited for the family." I allowed her to carry on with her conceited tour of my house, biting my tongue. I cleared my throat at last. "I think you should watch something before we discuss anything," I murmured, maintaining my composure despite the rage building inside of me. I pointed to the big TV that was hung on the wall. "Kindly take a seat, everyone among you." Their expressions flashed confused, but they obliged, plopping down on the couch. Sophie sat on the armrest with a frustrated expression. I watched my family's color fade as the surveillance tape rolled on the screen. Their looks changed from bewilderment to outrage to terror when they realized their plan had been captured on tape. It was Sophie who broke the dumbfounded stillness first. It was just a prank," she said, fear rising in her voice. "We didn't mean any harm." David gave a forceful nod, scowling as the motion jarred his broken leg. "Yes, it was merely a prank that went too far. Is there really a need to make a big deal out of this?" Nonetheless, it appeared that my parents understood how serious the issue was. With a pale face, my father bent over. "Chloe, my love, let's not rush things. This doesn't need to be made public. We as a family can resolve this." I smiled, a stoic, unentertaining smile that made them all cringe. "It's a bit late for that, don't you think?" I looked at my watch and remarked. "And speaking of late, I believe we have some guests arriving." The knock on the door came as if right out of nowhere. I had phoned the police earlier that morning, and when I opened it, I saw two of them. As I ushered them in, I said, "Perfect timing. Officers, I have evidence of an attempted break-in and a malicious attempt at blackmail." There was a frenzy of action after that. I gave the cops an explanation of the issue and showed them the disturbing security footage. After giving a somber listening, they proceeded to arrest Sophie and David. My parents sobbed as the cops told them their rights. My mother cried, "Chloe, please, don't do this, we're family." I had a brief moment of despair, but it was swiftly eclipsed by years of anger and bitterness that had been harbored. "You should have thought of that before you tried to steal my home and hurt my dog," I remarked harshly. "I think it's time for you to leave." Tearfully, they walked away, trailing after Sophie and David as they were led to the police vehicle. I went to the animal shelter to bring Max home that evening, feeling as though a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. His tail was wagging wildly as he showered my face with kisses, clearly thrilled to see me. I gave him a strong embrace and muttered, "Let's head home, buddy." The weeks that followed flew by. David and Sophie were detained and put on trial. Using the unambiguous footage from my security cameras, they were determined to have tried both extortion and breaking and entering. They were given suspended sentences and a heavy fine, which I was rewarded. I decided to break up all contact with my close family members. Still, I thought it crucial that the rest of the family be made aware of the reality. I forwarded copies of the surveillance footage and a thorough report of what had happened to all of our family. The outpouring of support was tremendous. Once critical of my self-centeredness, aunts, uncles, and cousins now offered words of support and contrition. Sophie, David, and my parents were shunned at family get-togethers. Not even the most understanding relatives could forgive them for what they had done. For my part, things started to get better. I kept getting better at what I did, and I was happier than ever at what I did. Max and I created a cozy routine and took pleasure in taking lengthy walks in the neighborhood park. I got to know Greg, a generous software developer with a golden retriever named Luna, on one of these walks. We bonded over our mutual love of dogs and our shared experiences growing up in challenging homes right away. After exchanging numbers, we started dating, and every day that went by, our connection became stronger.